In a luxurious setting, surrounded by flowers, promises, and admiring looks, a woman believes she is seconds away from living the happiest moment of her entire life. But when an unexpected discovery happens moments before the ceremony begins, what seemed to be a perfect fairy tale transforms into a silent, cold nightmare that is impossible to ignore. Between secrets, ambition, and a betrayal hidden behind carefully rehearsed gestures of love, she will need to choose between crumbling in the face of pain or facing, with her head held high, the greatest humiliation of her life. And before hundreds of guests, what happens next transforms a marriage of appearances into an unforgettable reckoning. Before diving into this story of shock, courage, and a plot twist, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next emotional reports. The dress weighed less than Valentina expected. Italian silk, hand-embroidered, 8 months of production in an atelier in Milan that her father had hired without a second thought. She stood still before the full-length mirror in the presidential suite of the Grand São Paulo Hotel, looking at her own image as if she were seeing an old photograph of someone she barely knew. Her hair was pinned in soft waves, jasmine flowers intertwined in the curls that fell over her neck. 32 years old, the biggest day of her life, and she felt her fingers were freezing. Valentina Andrade Montero was the only daughter of Renato Montero, founder of Montero Textile, one of the largest luxury fashion and fabric groups in the country. She had grown up among international fairs, board meetings, and the unmistakable smell of new fabric in the factories of Americana. She had learned from an early age that name and reputation were assets as precious as real estate registered in a notary's office, and she had also learned to distrust easy smiles, or so she believed. It had been 2 years and 3 months since Caio Drummond had entered her life during a launch cocktail party at São Paulo Fashion Week. Tall, discreet, elegant, without ostentation. He didn't approach her immediately, which intrigued her. He kept watching the event from afar, glass in hand, until she approached him herself. He smiled calmly, introduced himself as a corporate restructuring consultant, and said he was at the event as an obligation for a client. He knew nothing about fashion, he said, and she found that refreshing. The courtship was slow at first, almost hesitant. He showed no hurry, did not suffocate her with attention, did not try to impress with extravagant spending. On the contrary, he set up simple dates, talked with depth, listened with a patience she had never found in anyone before. At 3 months, he met her father. Renato Montero, a man of few words and precise evaluations, had said after dinner that Caio seemed to be a serious person. This compliment, coming from him, was worth gold. The marriage proposal happened at a vineyard in the countryside of Bento Gonçalves, Rio Grande do Sul. She had cried with happiness. She posted a photo. Congratulations came by the thousands. And the preparations began with the silent urgency that only great families know how to create. A guest list of 240 people, a buffet by Chef Adriana Lino, a chamber orchestra, flowers from Holambra, a ceremony in the grand ballroom of the Grand São Paulo Hotel itself, where the Montero family had held every significant milestone of the last 3 decades. On that Saturday in September, the hotel was impeccable. Vases of white orchids in the hallway, a burgundy carpet under the guests' feet, photographer and videographer positioned at the right angles. Valentina knew every detail because she had approved every decision, often until late at night while Caio slept, and she went through spreadsheets in the next room. He rarely gave an opinion on the preparations. He said he trusted her taste. At the time, it seemed like kindness. Her best friend, Fernanda Luz, had been by her side in the suite since 6 in the morning. Fernanda was the communications director of Montero Textile and had been the first person Valentina told about Caio, months before anything was official. The two had known each other since their business administration days at FGV, survived exams, trips, crises, and joys together. Fernanda was now adjusting the veil with precise fingers and saying that she looked absurdly beautiful. Valentina smiled at her friend in the reflection of the mirror. There was something strange about that smile, but she couldn't name what. Nervousness, perhaps. It was normal. Everyone said it was normal. Fernanda's mother had vomited from anxiety at her own wedding, and then stayed happily married for 40 years. Valentina took a deep breath, held the bouquet of gardenias, and said she needed 2 minutes alone before going down. Fernanda understood without needing anything explained. She took her cell phone and left discreetly, promising to return in 5 minutes. The room went quiet. Valentina heard the air conditioning, the soft vibration of the hotel, the muffled footsteps in the hallway. She closed her eyes. It was in this silence that she heard the voice. It wasn't loud. It came from the other side of the partition wall, from the anteroom that connected the presidential suite to the studio reserved for the groom to prepare. A male voice, low, too intimate for what should have been a last-minute protocol conversation before the ceremony. Valentina didn't move at first, thinking the sound would end, but the voice continued, and the tone of familiarity grew until she felt a chill run down her shoulders. She took a step toward the wall, then one more. Her heart began to beat with a strange cadence, neither fast nor slow, but different, as if it knew before her mind that something was wrong. She pressed her ear against the cold plaster surface and tried to separate the words from the hotel's ambient noise. Caio's voice was unmistakable, deep, deliberate, with that controlled inflection he used in meetings when he wanted to seem more confident than he was. But the tone now was different. It wasn't a meeting tone. It was the tone of someone speaking to someone who knows the backside of things, someone who doesn't need protocol or masks. Valentina remained motionless, the silk of her dress lightly brushing the wall. The bouquet of gardenias squeezed against her chest, as if the flowers could protect her from what she was about to hear. The words arrived in fragments first, a name she didn't recognize, a low laugh that wasn't of joy but of complicity, and then, clear as an alarm signal in the hotel's silence, came the sentence she would never be able to unlearn. He said that in a few hours he would be on the other side of the finish line, and that after that everything would be much simpler to manage. Valentina didn't move. Her brain tried to construct an alternative interpretation, as it does when it doesn't want to accept what the heart has already understood. Maybe it was a partner. Maybe it was about some pending business. Maybe she was misinterpreting the context of a conversation that had started before she leaned her ear against the wall. But then he said the name. He said it with a softness that was the opposite of what she knew, a softness that revealed intimacy, and Valentina understood that that voice was not for her. The hotel continued to function around her. On some floor below, the orchestra was doing a quick rehearsal. At the reception, guests were starting to arrive. Valentina's father would be coming down from the neighboring room at any moment, in a charcoal grey suit, his tie knot adjusted 3 times, until it was at the exact angle, as he always did. In a few minutes, he would knock on the door and ask if she was ready. She wasn't. Valentina moved away from the wall carefully, as if any sudden movement could make the world collapse faster than it was already collapsing. She looked in the mirror again. The dress was still the same. The flowers in her hair were still in the right places. Her lipstick was intact. On the outside, nothing had changed. On the inside, a crack had opened from the top of her head to the soles of her feet, and she felt every inch of that fissure, with a precision that only betrayal knows how to produce. She thought about the 2 years and 3 months. She thought about the dinner where he met her father and stayed until midnight, talking about the fabric export market. She thought about the times he asked to see the company's annual reports, saying he wanted to better understand her world. She thought about the conversations about the future, about where they would live, about how he would love to participate in Montero Textile's decisions if one day it was convenient for Renato. Every memory was being rewritten before her eyes, and what seemed like affection became calculation, what seemed like interest became strategy. The suite door opened. Fernanda entered with a smile that disappeared immediately upon seeing her friend's expression. She had known Valentina for almost 10 years. She knew every nuance of her face. What she saw now was not bridal nervousness. It was something else entirely, and Fernanda crossed the room in 4 steps, ignored the veil, ignored the bouquet, and held her friend's face with both hands. Valentina didn't cry. She took a deep breath, looked into Fernanda's eyes and said with a voice that surprised herself with its firmness that she needed to tell her something before that ceremony began. Fernanda said nothing. She just closed the door behind her, pulled up a chair and sat in front of her friend, with the total attention of someone who knows that what she is about to hear will change something forever. Fernanda listened to everything without interrupting once. Valentina spoke in a low voice, measuring every word, describing what she had heard with the cold precision of someone trying not to collapse. The intimate tone, the unknown name, the sentence about the finish line, and the detail that hurt the most, the way Caio had spoken of her, of the ceremony, of everything happening in that hotel, as if it were an ongoing operation and not the most important day in the life of someone who trusted him completely. When Valentina finished, Fernanda remained quiet for a few seconds, not out of doubt but to carefully choose what she would say next. She knew her friend well enough to know that any rash word could go the wrong way. Valentina didn't need comfort now. She needed someone to think with her. Then Fernanda said, with the same calmness she used to conduct crisis meetings at the company, that before any decision they needed to be sure of what they were dealing with. What she had heard was serious, but it was a fragment. If they were going to act, they needed something concrete. Valentina looked at her friend with an expression that mixed gratitude and astonishment. She expected tears, maybe anger, maybe a long hug. Instead, she got reasoning, and she realized that was exactly what she needed. The two were silent for a moment. The noise of the hotel continued around them, oblivious. The orchestra stopped its rehearsal. The voices of the guests arrived in waves from the hallway. Time was not on their side. It was Fernanda who remembered that the groom's studio was right next to the anteroom, with access through a side door that led to the service hallway. The hallway was busy at that hour, but not so much as to be impossible. If Caio had made the call in there and had left something recorded, they needed to find it before the moment passed. Valentina stood up. The silk of the dress rustled. She looked at the bouquet on the table, then at Fernanda, and said she wouldn't be able to go herself, not in those conditions, not with that dress that made invisibility impossible. Fernanda was already on her feet. She didn't need to say anything else. Fernanda left her bag on the chair, checked her phone, said she would be back in 10 minutes, and walked out the door with the ease of someone with a clear purpose. Valentina was left alone, this time without the silence of before. Now the silence had texture, had weight, had the exact shape of what she was waiting to discover. She tried not to let her thoughts run too far. She put the bouquet back on the counter and crossed her arms over her chest in a gesture that was not cold, but protective. She looked at the dress in the mirror once more. 8 months of production. Italian silk, hand-embroidered. And she was there, wearing it, while trying to find out if the man waiting for her at the altar had planned every smile, every conversation, every gesture of tenderness as pieces of a game that was never about her. The memory that came first was of a Sunday afternoon, almost a year earlier, when Caio had asked to see strategic planning documents that her father had given her to study before a board meeting. He had said it was curiosity, that he wanted to better understand the family business. She had opened everything without hesitation. Now that memory acquired a contour she didn't want to see. She was starting to put together a different puzzle with pieces that had always existed, when the door opened. Fernanda entered with an expression that Valentina recognized immediately. It was the expression of someone who found what they were looking for and is not happy about it. She closed the door without making a sound, walked over to her friend, and carefully placed the cell phone on the counter. The screen was open to an audio file. She explained in a low voice. The groom's studio had an event production computer turned on, used by the team to coordinate music and the timing of the ceremony. There was active ambient recording software, standard for events of that size, which recorded audio for technical adjustments. Caio's conversation had been recorded automatically. Fernanda had copied the file before leaving. Valentina looked at the cell phone. The file was just over 4 minutes long. She didn't need to listen immediately to know what was there. Fernanda's expression already said it all, but she listened anyway, with headphones in her ears, standing before the mirror in the most expensive room of the hotel, where her wedding would be celebrated in less than 40 minutes. Caio's voice came through the headphones with disturbing clarity. Calm, precise, without the slightest sign of guilt. He spoke to the other person like someone reporting the progress of a well-executed project. He used the word merger. He used the word consolidation. And when he mentioned Valentina, he used the definite article before her name, as if she were an item on a task list to be completed. Valentina took the headphones out of her ears before the file finished, not because she couldn't bear it, but because she had heard enough. She looked at Fernanda and said, with a voice that didn't tremble, that they needed to call her father. Fernanda nodded, but before opening the door she turned and said that when they called Renato they would need to be absolutely clear. Valentina's father was a man of facts and concrete consequences. They needed to present it as what it was. Not just a romantic betrayal, but a calculated attempt to compromise the family's assets. Valentina went to the window, looking down at Avenida Paulista. She breathed. When she turned around, there was something different on her face. The pain continued, but there was also a determination being born exactly from the extent of what had been done against her. Fernanda went to get Renato. Valentina stayed in the room, standing, her silk dress impeccable. 3 minutes later, the door opened and her father entered. In a charcoal grey suit, the tie knot perfect, but his eyes gave away more than he planned to show. Seeing his daughter standing like that without a smile, his eyes changed even before he said a word. Valentina didn't go with emotion. She started with what she had heard through the wall and followed with what Fernanda had found. She presented the facts in the order they happened, without adjectives, without tears. When she got to the part about the merger, Renato became completely motionless. Valentina finished by saying that what she had heard was enough to understand that Caio had planned that wedding as a strategic step in a project that targeted Montero Textile. The silence that followed lasted a few seconds. Renato looked at his daughter, then at Fernanda, then back at his daughter. Then he said, with the voice he used when he closed meetings with suppliers who had tried to deceive him, that he needed to hear the recording. Fernanda handed over the phone. Renato listened while standing, without sitting, without changing his expression. When the file finished, he returned the phone with almost exaggerated care, as if he needed an object in his hands while processing what he had just heard. He stared out the window for a few seconds. Then he turned to Valentina and said she had been very brave to tell him that. He also said that now they needed to be even braver in the decision of what they would do next. Valentina said she had already decided. They wouldn't cancel discreetly. They wouldn't let Caio leave that hotel with his narrative intact, presenting himself as the hurt party of a bride who got cold feet at the last minute. She wanted to go down that aisle, enter that hall and reach the altar, and there, before every one of the guests, do what needed to be done. Renato looked at his daughter for a long moment. There was something in that look that she recognized as pride, mixed with a pain he wouldn't express out loud. Then he said, with the same calmness with which he had built Montero Textile over 3 decades, that she could count on him every step of the way. The grand ballroom of the Grand São Paulo Hotel had a capacity for 300 people, but on that Sunday it was arranged for 240 guests. Rows of white chairs on both sides of the central aisle, floral arrangements of orchids and eucalyptus branches on golden poles, candles in crystal candlesticks scattered across the space. The light came through the high windows with that soft quality of a September morning in São Paulo, and the chamber orchestra, positioned in the far left corner, was finishing its warm-up with discreet string passages. Outside in the hallways and reception area, guests circulated with champagne and festive conversation. There were directors of partner companies, international suppliers, some well-known names from the fashion market, family from both sides, and long-time friends. It was the kind of list that took months to balance without offending anyone, and Valentina had done it carefully. Every person in that hall had been chosen for some reason that went beyond formality. Caio Drummond was at the end of the access corridor to the ballroom, talking to 2 men Valentina recognized as partners from his consultancy office. He was in a black suit, white shirt, thin bow tie. His expression was that of someone who knows what to do in any environment, relaxed without being casual, confident without being arrogant. It was one of the things that had caught her attention from the beginning. Caio had the gift of appearing exactly right for any situation. She observed him for a few seconds from afar, before he realized she had arrived. There was a time when this sight would have filled her with a kind of quiet pride. Now she saw the construction behind the image, the suit chosen to convey sophistication without ostentation, the smile distributed in just the right measure, the body language that communicated that he belonged in any space he occupied. Everything fitted together, everything calculated, everything at the service of an objective she only discovered too late. When Caio saw her arrive, his smile widened with a naturalness that almost made her falter. He moved away from the partners, approached, and said she looked simply perfect. He said this with his eyes on hers, with that focused attention that at the beginning of the relationship had seemed so rare and so precious. She smiled back. It wasn't hard. Pain and determination together produce a strange serenity, almost anesthetic. They exchanged the last words before the ceremony with the expected naturalness. He asked if she was okay. She said she was. He lightly touched her face and said that in a few minutes everything would be complete. Valentina absorbed that word with particular attention. Complete. Not happy, not perfect, not unforgettable. Complete, like the closing of a phase of a project. Then they separated for the ceremony positions, him heading to the altar with the groomsmen, her returning to the anteroom where her father and Fernanda waited. Renato was standing by the window with that straight posture he never lost, even in situations that would demand anything else. Fernanda had her phone in her hand. When Valentina entered, the two exchanged a quick look that needed no words. The plan was simple in structure. Valentina would enter the hall as expected, arm in arm with her father, walk down the aisle to the altar. The ceremony would follow protocol until the moment of the traditional question to the public, and then she would take the floor. There was an obvious risk in this choice. Caio could react in unpredictable ways. He could try to reverse the situation, appeal to the emotions of those present, call attention to her state as if it were instability. It was exactly the kind of response a man used to controlling narratives would try to construct in real time. But Fernanda had the file, and the file was irrefutable. The music changed in the hall. The orchestra began the piece Valentina had chosen months earlier, a Bach melody that had seemed elegant and significant at the time, and that now sounded with a gentle irony. Her father offered his arm. She took it. They walked down the outer hallway in silence. When they reached the entrance to the ballroom, the guests turned around. Most smiled upon seeing her. There was that specific type of attention a bride receives, a mixture of admiration and collective emotion, as if the beauty of the scene belonged to everyone at the same time. Valentina looked at every face she recognized. She saw aunts, college friends, co-workers. She saw Fernanda's mother in the third row, her eyes already glistening. She saw two of the Montero Textile board members sitting together near the center, with their respective spouses. She advanced down the center aisle with the right cadence, not rushed, not hesitant, step by step as she had rehearsed. The silk dress glided with an almost unreal smoothness. The flowers in her hair were in the right places, the bouquet of gardenias between her fingers. Caio was at the altar, facing her with his usual smile. From the angle where she was with the light of the ballroom, he seemed the perfect image of what he had set out to be. The admirable groom, the reliable man, the ideal companion for Renato Montero's daughter. It was a magnificent performance. Valentina recognized this now with a clarity that only comes when the veil falls at once, without ceremony. She reached the altar. Her father handed her over with a soft squeeze on her arm that said everything he wouldn't say out loud. Fernanda took her place among the guests, her phone put away but accessible. The ceremony began. The celebrant was a middle-aged man with a measured voice and a tone that conveyed solemnity without exaggeration. He had been a recommendation from the Montero family, someone who had conducted other important events over the years. He began with the customary opening words, talking about the meaning of commitment, about the choice to share a life with another human being, about the weight and beauty of standing before a community and declaring intentions. Valentina listened to every word with a different attention than she had imagined having at that moment. She had thought, at some point during the last 2 years of preparations, how she would feel in that ceremony. She had imagined emotion, relief, joy. She had imagined looking at Caio and feeling that quiet certainty that she had made the right choice. Instead, she was there with an absolutely clear mind, as if the pain had burned away everything that was imprecise and left only the essential. The celebrant spoke for a few minutes before reaching the formal section of the rite. The orchestra had stopped. The hall was in silence, that special silence of celebrations where 240 people hold their breath at the same time without planning it. Valentina looked at Caio. He looked back with his usual smile, secure, calculated, perfect. It was then that the celebrant asked the traditional question to the public, if there was any reason why that union should not happen, to speak now or forever, hold their peace. And it was Valentina who took a step forward. The entire hall reacted to this movement with a kind of collective suspension. There was no noise, there were no whispers. It was an immediate and total silence, as if the air in the room had changed nature in a fraction of a second. Caio lost his smile. Not from shock, but from evaluation, which was how he processed the unexpected. Not with emotion, but with an immediate calculation of how to respond. Valentina looked at him before speaking. She gave him exactly 2 seconds of a direct look, without anger, without tears, without trembling. And then she turned to the hall. Valentina's voice came out firm, not too loud, not too low, with the right range for everyone in the hall to hear without her needing to shout. She said there was, indeed, a reason why that union should not happen, and she said this with a calmness that surprised even herself, as if all the hours of that morning had prepared her exactly for that second. The hall remained completely motionless. 240 people, each with their expression frozen somewhere between confusion, surprise, and a foreboding that something serious was about to be revealed. The celebrant stepped back a pace, not knowing what to do because that was outside of any script he had conducted before. Valentina started with the simple truth. She said that moments before the ceremony, while seeking a few minutes of silence in the anteroom, she heard the groom on a call on the other side of the wall. A call that was not about business. An intimate call, addressed to a woman with whom he maintained a parallel relationship while planning the wedding with her. A call in which he referred to the ceremony they were about to celebrate not as a commitment of love, but as the final stage of a calculated plan to access the assets and shareholding power of Montero Textile. She used the words he had used: merger, consolidation, finish line. She said she was not inventing or exaggerating. She said there was proof. Caio reacted before she finished. His voice cut through the air of the hall with a security that only a person accustomed to managing crises in real time can maintain. He said she was under enormous pressure, that it was understandable to be anxious at that moment, that it was pre-ceremony nervousness amplified by a misunderstanding. He said this with a condescending smile that he should have contained, because it was exactly that smile that made the eyes of several people in the hall change expression. Renato Montero, sitting in the first row, did not move. He had a stern face with that expression Valentina had known since she was a girl, the one he used when he had made a decision and was waiting for the right moment to apply it. Valentina turned to Caio and said, with the same calmness as before, that she understood the attempt. She said that the narrative of the hysterical bride was efficient in normal situations, but that in this case there was a detail that made it ineffective. The conversation had been recorded. Caio's smile lasted 2 seconds longer than it should have. Then it disappeared. Fernanda was already on her feet. She walked down the side aisle of the hall with quick steps and, without hesitation, went up the 2 steps of the small stage where the ceremony's sound system was installed and connected the phone to the equipment. There was a sound technician nearby who instinctively stepped back upon seeing her expression. The silence that existed in the hall deepened when the first seconds of the audio came out of the speakers. The quality was good enough for every word to be understood without effort. Caio's voice, calm, precise, without affection. The word merger, the word consolidation, the mention of Montero Textile, and then, in the part that none of Valentina's words would have managed to convey with the same force, the way he referred to the bride during the conversation, with the definite article as an asset in a portfolio, as someone he managed and not someone he loved. The file lasted a little over 4 minutes. None of the 240 people in the hall moved during that time, nor whispered. It was as if the weight of what they were hearing needed silence to be completely absorbed. When the audio finished, Caio tried to speak. He said the audio was out of context, that there was an explanation, but his voice came out with a crack that didn't exist before, and the people who knew him well enough to notice that difference noticed. It was Renato who stood up. Not in a dramatic way, not with broad gestures. He stood up with the slowness of someone who acts with all available deliberation and doesn't need to rush anything because the authority is already given. He walked to the front of the hall, stood beside his daughter, and turned to those present with the same posture he used in the company's board meetings. He said that as of that date, any professional association, any talk about collaboration or shareholding participation between Montero Textile and any entity linked to the name of Caio Drummond was terminated. He said this with 6 words, and the surgical precision of someone who knows that the only power the other side still had was the power to scratch a reputation, and that power had evaporated the moment the audio came out of the speakers. Caio stayed at the altar for a few more seconds. There was in his expression something Valentina had never seen before. An absence. Not anger, not shame, not despair. Just the void of someone who lost the centerpiece of a game they had set up with patience and precision over 2 years. Then he went down the altar steps, without running, without looking to the sides, and left the hall through the side entrance. Valentina watched him go without feeling the need to say anything else. She had said everything that needed to be said. The rest belonged to him, to the weight of what he had done, and to what would come after that. It was not her responsibility to manage the collapse of a man who had built his own trap. The hall began to murmur after the door closed. Gradually the sound of voices grew, but Valentina heard nothing clearly. She was looking at the bouquet of gardenias she still had in her hands, that bouquet she had held with such care all morning, and thinking that the flowers were strangely doing very well. Fernanda appeared beside her before any guest could get close. She held her friend's arm firmly, not for support but in presence, in confirmation that there was someone beside her who knew all the weight of that morning. Valentina looked at her. Fernanda didn't say anything at first. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be unnecessary or insufficient. Then she just said she was proud of her. Valentina nodded. It wasn't the nod of someone agreeing with a compliment. It was that of someone recognizing finally that she did what needed to be done and is beginning to process the cost of it. The closest guests began to approach. Fernanda's mother was the first, with red eyes and an expression that mixed horror with admiration. 2 of the Montero Textile board members addressed Renato with stern expressions and low voices. That kind of discreet conversation that in corporate environments always happens at the most inappropriate and at the same time most necessary moments. Valentina looked at the altar one last time. The candlestick with 3 candles was still lit. The white orchids in the arrangements were still perfect. The aisle where she had walked arm in arm with her father still had petals scattered along the sides. It was the exact setting for the wedding she had planned in such detail for so long, and now it was there intact, waiting for a ceremony that would not happen. She took the flowers out of her hair one by one calmly and left them on the first guest bench to her right. Then she looked at the ring on her finger, that oval-cut solitaire he had placed with such solemnity at the vineyard in Bento Gonçalves. She stared at it for a few seconds. Then she took it off, walked the few steps to the altar, and placed it on the wooden pedestal where the wedding bands were displayed for the ceremony that would no longer be held. There was no broad gesture. There was no closing word. The jewel simply stayed there on the dark velvet of the pedestal, alone and precise, while Valentina turned her back to the altar for the first time that morning. The anteroom where it had all begun was empty when Valentina entered. The hotel continued to function around her, the hallways with the movement of a structure that doesn't stop for anything, but that small space next to the groom's studio was silent and tidy, as if nothing had happened there that morning. Valentina closed the door behind her and stood in the center of the room for a few minutes, alone. It was the first moment she had been completely alone since the day had begun. Since Fernanda had entered the suite early in the morning with coffee and that smile of complicity, the room had been in constant motion. Now the silence was different from all the others she had encountered throughout those hours. It wasn't the silence of waiting, nor the silence of shock. It was the silence of after. Valentina sat in a small chair against the wall and stared at her hands. The finger where the ring had been had a slight mark, a thin line on the skin that would take a few days to disappear. She observed it like someone studying a geographic detail on a map, trying to understand what it represented. 2 years and 3 months, a line on the skin that would vanish in days. There was something almost absurd in that proportion. The crying came without warning, as it does when there is nothing left to be done and the body can finally release what it had held for hours. It wasn't the kind of crying that paralyzes. It was the other kind, the one that happens while the person is still sitting straight, still looking at a fixed point, still functioning. Silent tears without sobbing, as if the body knew she needed dignity, even in that moment of private collapse. She cried for the man she had loved, even knowing now that that man didn't really exist, that he was a careful construction intended to work exactly on her, with all her specificities. She cried for the afternoon of the marriage proposal in Bento Gonçalves, for the wine she had drunk while laughing with happiness, without imagining she was inside a script. She cried for the year of preparations, for the conversations about where they would live, for the plans she had made inside her head in a bed at 3 a.m. when he slept beside her without knowing she was awake, dreaming about their future. She cried for everything that had been real to her, and that she discovered that morning had never been real on the other side. But she didn't cry for long. She had learned early, growing up beside Renato Montero, that crying is necessary and that it has a natural duration when you respect it. It doesn't need to be cut off, but it also doesn't need to be extended beyond what the moment asks for. She let it follow its course, and when it ended she stared out the small window of the anteroom with dry eyes and a lighter head than she had had in hours. Fernanda entered without knocking. She was the only person in the world who did that without Valentina being bothered. She sat on the floor next to the chair, leaned her head on her friend's knee, with a naturalness that only exists between people who have already shared enough spaces to not need formality, and stayed like that for a few minutes without saying anything. Valentina kept her hand on Fernanda's hair, in a slow and automatic gesture, the kind of gesture two people make when they don't need words to communicate that they are present for each other. After a while, Fernanda asked how she was, not in a way that needed an elaborate answer. She asked as if asking about the weather directly, expecting the simple truth. Valentina said she was bad and that she was also good. She said there was something strange about feeling destroyed and whole at the same time, as if the two conditions were not mutually exclusive. Fernanda said they weren't. She said they were, in fact, what happened when a person does the right thing at the most difficult moment. The destruction is real, but there is something that cannot be destroyed by any betrayal, and it is exactly that something that stays intact when everything else collapses. Valentina was silent for a moment. Then she said there was one thing she hadn't told Fernanda yet, something she had discovered a few weeks earlier, and that she had kept without knowing exactly why. Fernanda raised her head and looked at her. Valentina said that about a month ago she had found in their apartment a printed email that had fallen behind the drawer of Caio's desk. She had read it by accident. It was an exchange with someone identified only by initials, discussing a schedule that included dates of corporate commitments and the deadline of a confidentiality agreement linked to a marriage contract that mentioned her name. At the time, she had kept the paper and tried to find an explanation that made sense. She had thought it was something related to his work, some other client, some coincidence of names. She had convinced herself that she was interpreting it wrong because she didn't want to interpret it right. She had folded the paper, put it back behind the drawer, and never touched the subject again. Fernanda looked at her for a long moment. Then she said that sometimes we know before we know, and that keeping that hadn't been weakness. It had been the interval of time she needed to be ready to face what she was seeing. Valentina thought about that. There was truth there. It wasn't a comfortable truth, but it was honest, and she preferred honesty to empty consolation. She stared out the window again. Outside, the September sky continued with that specific quality of a São Paulo morning, clear and white at the same time, without committing to anything. She told Fernanda she needed to see her father before anything else, that she needed to have a conversation with him that went beyond today's plan, that reached what would come after. Fernanda nodded and said he was waiting upstairs, that he had asked to be notified when she was ready. Valentina stood up from the chair. She adjusted her silk dress with a simple and mechanical gesture and went to the door. Before opening it, she turned to Fernanda and said there was one last thing she wanted to say. She said she had spent 2 years building something with someone who had never been building along with her, and that this was the kind of error that didn't exist in any classification she knew before. It wasn't naivety, it wasn't carelessness, it wasn't excess of trust. It was simply the result of trusting someone who had invested all the intelligence they possessed into being exactly worthy of trust. Fernanda said that didn't make her responsible for what he had done. Valentina said she knew, and she said it took a long time to understand that knowing that didn't make the weight smaller, but that it was fundamental to know it anyway, because without it, the only option was to keep carrying the other person's guilt as if it were your own, and she had no intention of doing that. Fernanda smiled. It was the smile of someone hearing a friend say the right thing at the right time, not because she was taught to say it, but because she got there on her own through the hardest path. Valentina opened the door and stepped out into the hotel hallway. Renato Montero was sitting in an armchair in the corner of the suite when Valentina entered. He had taken off his jacket and loosened his tie, which for him was the equivalent of being in a complete collapse. He had a cup of coffee in his hand that was probably already cold, and he stared at the space before him with that expression Valentina recognized from childhood, the one he had when he was processing a big problem and hadn't yet reached any conclusion that satisfied him. She sat in the armchair beside him. For a few minutes neither of them spoke. It was a different silence from those she had encountered throughout the morning. It was the silence of 2 years of a father's work being reviewed in the light of a discovery that changed the interpretation of every step. Valentina knew that Renato was at that moment reviewing every interaction with Caio, every dinner, every conversation about the company, every time he had opened a piece of data or shared a context, because he trusted the future son-in-law was part of the family. Her father spoke first. He said he had made an error of judgment. He said this with the painful precision of someone who has no habit of sparing himself when he examines his own mistakes. He said he had liked the young man too much too early, and that the fact of liking him had interfered with the analysis he made of any new person who entered the orbit of the company or the family. Valentina said he wasn't alone in that. She said she had done the same, and that maybe their mistake wasn't having liked him. It was human to like someone who invests so much effort into being likable. The mistake, if there was one, was not having created a space for doubt even within affection. It was not having separated, not even once, what they felt from what they saw with clarity. Renato stared at the cup for a moment. Then he said there was something else, and that he needed to say it soon because he couldn't let it pass. He said he had noticed in the last weeks before the wedding that some company strategy documents had been accessed more times than would be normal from a device that was not his or any of the directors. He had investigated discreetly with the technology sector and hadn't reached anything concrete at the time, but now the pattern made sense. Valentina was quiet while her father spoke. There was a part of her that wanted to be surprised by that, and a part that simply confirmed what she was already suspecting, that Caio's level of planning went beyond what she had imagined even after hearing the audio. It was a systematic, patient construction, set up with the precision of someone who does not act on impulse. Renato said that the legal department had already been contacted even before he went up to that room by phone, during the minutes Fernanda had sought Valentina in the anteroom. He had instructed that any documentation linked to Caio's name or his consulting office be preventively blocked and audited. It was a precautionary measure. The real damage would need to be evaluated with more calm, but the block was immediate. Valentina heard all this with the same attention she had used throughout the morning. There was something almost absurd about sitting in a wedding dress discussing preventive auditing with her father at 11:30 in the morning on a Saturday in September, but the absurdity was a part of the day she had decided to accept, without trying to normalize it. She told her father there was one thing he needed to know, something she had kept for weeks without fully understanding why. And she told him about the paper she had found behind the drawer, the initials, the dates, the mention of the contract, and the confidentiality agreement. Renato listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was silent for a few seconds. Then he said that was exactly the kind of detail the legal team needed to map the extent of what had been attempted. He also said, and in this his voice changed slightly, that he regretted she had carried that alone for weeks without knowing what to do with it. Valentina said that at the time she didn't know exactly what she was carrying. There was a part of her that knew, but she and that part hadn't reached an agreement. Her father put the coffee cup on the side table and turned to her completely. He said she had done something today that he wasn't sure he would be able to do in her place. He said he had seen brides paralyzed by much less, and that what she had done hadn't just been protecting herself. She had protected the company, the family, and she had done it without losing what he always recognized as the most important thing in her, the dignity that doesn't bend when under pressure. Valentina looked at her father. There were moments when he said things like that, and she didn't know exactly what to do with them, because he didn't have the habit of expressing that kind of feeling often, and when he did, the weight was considerable. She was quiet for a moment, absorbing it. Then she said she was exhausted, that she wanted to take off the dress, eat something, and that after that they could talk about what would come next with the calm the situation demanded. But for today, for that specific morning, what she needed most was to breathe. Renato nodded. He stood up, approached his daughter, and put his hand on her shoulder for a second, the physical gesture of affection that was the most he naturally offered, and that, coming from him, meant exactly what was necessary. Then he said Fernanda was waiting in the hallway and that he had already asked for something to be brought to eat. Valentina smiled for the first time in hours. The meal arrived on discreet trays. There was bread, fruit, cheese, orange juice. Valentina ate with a hunger she hadn't realized she felt until the first piece of bread reached her mouth. Fernanda sat on the other side of the table and ate without talking about heavy subjects. It was a deliberate and necessary pause, the kind two intelligent people take when they know the essential has already been said, and that continuing to dig for now would be exhaustion without purpose. When they finished, Valentina said she needed something that depended on Fernanda's collaboration. She said there were some people in the hall, close guests, long-time friends, who deserved a more direct explanation than what had been given publicly. Not a justification, not a review of what had happened, just a personal communication, made with respect, that recognized they had attended in good faith and that they deserved to be treated with the same good faith in return. Fernanda said she would take care of it. She said she knew every name on the list and that she knew how to have that conversation without turning it into additional drama. It was, deep down, exactly the kind of task for which her role at Montero Textile had prepared her over the years. Crisis communication with precision and care. Valentina thanked her. Then she said there was one more thing, that the next day when messages and phone calls started to arrive, she didn't want to answer anything for anyone for at least 48 hours. She needed silence before deciding how to narrate what had happened to the outside world. Fernanda said she understood completely, and she said she would take care of filtering everything that arrived until Valentina said she was ready. Valentina closed her eyes for a second. The exhaustion was present with a depth that went beyond physical fatigue. When she opened her eyes, she said one last thing to Fernanda, that there was no right word for what her friend had done that morning, but that she needed to know that what had been done was not small and would not be forgotten. Fernanda didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said with that direct smile that was exclusively hers, that was what friendships existed for the days when life asks for more than one person can carry alone. 3 weeks later, Montero Textile held an extraordinary board meeting. Valentina entered the meeting room on the 22nd floor of the headquarters on Avenida Faria Lima, wearing a light grey blazer and a folder of documents under her arm. It was the first meeting she attended with a different role, not as the daughter of the founder, a frequent observer of decisions, but as the formal candidate for the position of Director of Strategic Development, a position that had been discussed in vague terms for more than a year, and that Renato had now decided to formalize. The meeting agenda had 2 points. The first was the presentation of the audit report on the irregular accesses identified in the weeks before the wedding. The second was the vote for the creation of the position. Valentina sat beside her father, but slightly apart so that it was clear they were two distinct presences with distinct roles. It was a small detail she had discussed with Renato the week before. She didn't want to enter that position because of her proximity to the founder. She wanted to enter because of what she had demonstrated she understood about strategy, because of what she had proven she was capable of doing under pressure, and because of what she was presenting in that folder of documents, which contained an expansion plan for the technical fabrics market that she had developed over the last 2 years in parallel with everything else that had happened in her life. The audit report was presented by the technology director with the technical objectivity that the situation required. The irregular accesses had been mapped. The scope was smaller than the worst-case scenario, but larger than expected. Some pricing models and a growth projection for the next 3 years had been viewed from an unauthorized external device on dates that coincided with Caio's visits to Valentina's apartment. It hadn't been data transfer, just consultation. The direct damage was limited, but the exposure had existed. Valentina listened to the report with attention and without changing her expression. She had read the draft version 2 days before, so there was nothing there that was news. But hearing it out loud in that room before the board members had a different weight than reading it alone. It was the formal materialization of something that had started in a hotel anteroom with an ear pressed against a plaster wall. When the report finished, one of the board members asked Valentina directly if she had anything to add. She said she did. She said the responsibility for the access had been facilitated by a trust she had extended without the proper protocols. She said she had learned from it, and that one of the first proposals she would present in the new position, if approved, was a review of information security policies applied to people with access to the domestic environment of directors and managers. It was a policy that didn't exist because no one had needed it before. Now there was a concrete reason to create it. The board member nodded. There was no awkward silence after that. What happened was the kind of silence that occurs when someone says the right thing and the other people present need a second to recognize it. The second point of the agenda was faster. The vote for the position was unanimous. Renato recorded the result without additional comment, the way he recorded any decision he had considered inevitable from the start and that just needed time to become official. After the meeting, when the board members were leaving and the assistants were collecting folders and glasses of water, Fernanda appeared at the entrance of the meeting room with 2 coffees. She entered, closed the door behind her, and placed one of the coffees in front of Valentina, with a smile that contained both irony and genuine satisfaction. She said there was something she needed to tell. She said that the previous week, on Thursday afternoon, she had received a message from an unknown number. The message said the sender was someone who had been present that Saturday in September at the Grand São Paulo Hotel, and that they wanted Fernanda to know that what the 2 of them had done had reached a group of people beyond those in the hall. That the story had circulated in some circles of the financial and consulting markets, and that at least 2 companies that had been negotiating with Caio's office had withdrawn partnership proposals after learning of what had happened. Valentina looked at Fernanda for a long moment. She said she hadn't asked for that. She said that hadn't been the goal. Fernanda said she knew. She said that was exactly why it had happened. When something is done with the right intention, it has a consistency that stands on its own, without needing amplification. The people who were in that hall had left with a story, and stories with consistency move on their own. Valentina was silent for a moment. She took a sip of the coffee. Then she said there was something she wanted to do that week, a small thing she had been putting off because she didn't know if it would be the right decision. She said she wanted to go back to Bento Gonçalves. Fernanda looked at her with an expression that was half surprise and half immediate understanding. Valentina said it wasn't to revisit the marriage proposal. It wasn't to undo any memory. It was because there was a specific vineyard she had genuinely liked on that trip, regardless of everything else that had happened on it, and she didn't want the version of herself that existed before that Saturday in September to be the last version to have been there. Fernanda took a sip of her own coffee. Then she said she was free for the weekend and asked if the reservation should be for 2 people. Valentina smiled. She said yes. On the Thursday before the trip, Valentina arrived early at the Montero Textile headquarters before most employees began to enter. She went up to the floor of her new office, a space being reorganized for her with the discretion that well-conducted transitions require, and stood at the window for a few minutes, looking at Faria Lima waking up below. There was a file open on the computer that she had prepared the night before, the expansion plan for technical fabrics, with the numbers revised for the 3rd time, partners mapped, and windows of opportunity identified with precision. It was a 2-year work that had survived a lot. It had survived sleepless nights, strategy reviews, changes in the economic scenario, and it had also survived a Saturday in September that had rewritten a lot around it without rewriting the plan itself. There was something she had learned in those 3 weeks that wasn't in any management manual, that what you build out of your own conviction has a durability that doesn't depend on the surroundings. The marriage had collapsed. The company was standing. The plan was standing. She was standing. She opened the document, updated the date in the header, and began to work. It was thus in silence and with the window open to the morning that Valentina Andrade Montero began the first real day of the position she always knew would come. Not by inheritance, not by convenience. By every decision she had made, including the most difficult ones, especially the most difficult ones, which had led her to that chair on that floor on that October morning in São Paulo. On the other side of the desk, the folder with the expansion plan waited with the particular patience of projects that are ready to begin. The weekend in Bento Gonçalves arrived with a Saturday of firm sun and mild temperature, the kind of weather that the Vale dos Vinhedos reserves for moments when it seems to be collaborating deliberately. Valentina and Fernanda arrived by car on Friday night after a 3-hour trip from Porto Alegre and settled into a small inn among the vines in the same valley but on a different property from where the marriage proposal had happened. This choice had been made with intention. Valentina didn't want repetition, she wanted construction. She wanted a new place that would be, from that weekend on, associated with a different memory. On Saturday morning, the two had breakfast on a balcony overlooking the rows of grapevines descending the slope. The October light in Rio Grande do Sul has a specific quality, golden and horizontal in the early hours, which makes any landscape seem deliberately painted. Valentina stared at it for a long time without speaking, her coffee getting cold in her hand. Fernanda let the silence exist. It was one of the things Valentina most valued in her friend, the ability to identify when a person's silence is a request for company and not for conversation, and to offer exactly that. When Valentina spoke, it was about something she had been thinking about throughout those weeks. She said there was a detail in what had happened that she was still processing, and that it wasn't what most people would imagine it to be. It wasn't the betrayal itself, it wasn't the extent of the plan, it wasn't the recording or the altar or the ring. It was something more private. She said what weighed the most was the ease with which she had believed. Not in a naive way, not for lack of intelligence or experience, but because there was something in her that had wanted to believe so completely that she had created space for anything contrary to that belief to stay out of focus. There was a complicity of hers in the construction of the illusion, and recognizing that wasn't guilt, but it was responsibility, and the difference between the two things mattered. Fernanda was silent for a moment. Then she said there was something in that analysis that was true, but there was also a part that she needed to question. She said there was a difference between recognizing that one wanted to believe and concluding that that had been a mistake. Wanting to believe in someone is what people who love do. It is the natural movement of trust. The problem wasn't in that movement. The problem was that the other person had used that movement as a lever. Valentina stared at the grapevines. Then she said she understood what Fernanda was saying, and she said there was a part of her that agreed completely, and there was another part that was still processing the distinction and needed time to reach the point where the two parts agreed. Fernanda said that time was exactly what there was, and that there was no obligation to get there faster than the process itself allowed. In the afternoon, the two visited the vineyard that had motivated the trip. It was a small family-run property, led by an enologist who had studied in Bordeaux and returned to the south of Brazil with the conviction that the Gaucho terroir had potential the market had not yet fully understood. He received them personally and conducted a tasting that had the specific quality of someone explaining what they love without needing to inflate what they are explaining. Valentina paid attention to every detail, to the tone of the Tannat grape in the glass, to the way the enologist described the influence of altitude and valley humidity on the character of the wine, to the difference between two harvests separated by a single summer of irregular rain. There was a language there she recognized from another context, the language of someone who dedicates years to building something with precision and patience, and who, when talking about that something, is also talking about a life choice. She bought 6 bottles of a special reserve that was not available for retail sale, and the enologist made a point of packaging each one with personal care. While packaging, he said there was one bottle he would recommend keeping for at least 2 years before opening. He said there were wines that needed time to reveal what they are, that trying to open them before the right moment was to lose the best version of what they could be. Valentina listened to him and kept that sentence with her for a long time afterward. On the way back to the inn, the two walked along a stretch of dirt road between the vines. The light was low, almost horizontal, that end-of-afternoon quality that makes the shadows of the grapevines stretch from one side of the path to the other in long, regular lines. Valentina walked among those shadows with the bag of bottles in her hand and felt for the first time in weeks something she couldn't name precisely, but that she recognized by the specific weight it had. It wasn't joy, it wasn't peace, it wasn't certainty about the future. It was something simpler and more fundamental, the feeling of being in exactly the right place, at the right moment, being exactly who she was, without needing to perform anything for anyone. Fernanda walked beside her without saying anything. When they arrived back at the inn, the two sat on the balcony again, the bottles safe inside, and watched the last stretch of sun disappear behind the slope, while the valley darkened with the particular calm of landscapes that exist in their own time, independent of anything that happens within the human beings who visit them. On Sunday morning before leaving, Valentina wrote the name of the inn and the date on a piece of paper. There was no diary, there was no previous habit of recording things like that, but there was something about that weekend she wanted to mark, not to remember but to establish. It was the first weekend after September. It was the first new place that belonged entirely to what came after. She folded the paper and put it in the inner pocket of her suitcase. In the car back to São Paulo, Fernanda fell asleep in the passenger seat shortly after Porto Alegre. Valentina drove in silence along the highway, with the landscape of Rio Grande do Sul passing on each side, that green and flat immensity of the Gaucho interior that has an almost meditative quality when one is inside it with a quiet mind. She thought of the expansion plan waiting in the folder at the office. She thought of the board meeting the following week. She thought of the 6 bottles carefully packed in the trunk, especially the one the enologist had said to keep for 2 years before opening, and about what might be revealed when the right time came. She thought also, with the honesty that the silence of a long highway allows, that there was a version of her life in which that Saturday in September had simply happened, and she had stayed at the altar and signed the papers and discovered the rest through a longer and more expensive path. And she felt with a clarity that needed no elaboration that the version in which she heard, understood and acted was the only one she could recognize as hers. Not because it had been the easiest, because it had been the most honest. And if there was one thing Valentina Andrade Monteiro had learned throughout that September, it was that honesty has a weight that hurts the moment it is required, but that after that, it sustains what needs to be sustained with a solidity that nothing else can offer. The highway continued. São Paulo was a little over 2 hours away, and she would arrive there ready for what came next. 2 years later, Monteiro Textile inaugurated its first line of technical fabrics aimed at the sustainable fashion market, the direct result of the expansion plan Valentina had developed and which was now in full operation. The launch ceremony took place in the company's showroom in Itaim Bibi, a space that had been renovated under her supervision with the same attention to detail she applied to anything she touched. Renato Monteiro spoke for 5 minutes. He thanked the partners, the collaborators, and introduced his daughter as the Director of Strategic Development who had led the project from start to finish. When Valentina went up to the small stage to speak, there were about 80 people in the room. Suppliers, commercial partners, sector journalists, some of the same board members who had voted for her appointment 2 years earlier. She spoke for 8 minutes. She started with the numbers the markets mapped, the partners won. She went through the vision for the future of the line, the differential it represented in the company's positioning. And she finished with something she hadn't planned to say until the moment arrived, that a 2-year development project existed for reasons that weren't always visible from the outside, and that sometimes the clarity to build something came from moments when everything else collapsed around you, because it was in those moments that it became evident what was solid and what was an illusion. There was no explicit reference to what had happened, but some of the people in the room understood. Fernanda, standing at the back of the space with a glass of sparkling wine in her hand, understood, and she smiled with that smile Valentina knew by heart. After the event, when the guests had already departed, and the team was collecting the last pieces of decoration, Fernanda approached and said she had received an invitation that week from a fashion consultant in Lisbon who wanted to see the new line and discuss a possible European collaboration. She said she had forwarded it to Valentina's department with a note that it was exactly the kind of window the plan had mapped as a priority. Valentina took a sip of the sparkling wine and said that the following week they would sit down to evaluate it. Fernanda said she already had the schedule marked. The two left the showroom together, as they had left so many other places together over 10 years. The October night in São Paulo had that quality the city only offers when the temperature drops and the air has a lightness that contrasts with everything else the daily life of the metropolis produces. Valentina stopped on the sidewalk for a second, looked at Avenida Brigadeiro Faria Lima with the traffic still intense even at that hour, and breathed. There was a bottle of wine kept in the cellar of her apartment, a special reserve from a vineyard in Bento Gonçalves, carefully packed by an enologist who had said it needed at least 2 years to reveal what it was. The deadline had arrived the previous month. She hadn't opened it yet. She thought it was time. She told Fernanda they had plans for that night. Fernanda asked which ones. Valentina said she would tell her in the car. Fernanda said okay, but that she was driving because Valentina always got too excited with sparkling wine and confused winery speed with highway speed. Valentina laughed. It was the kind of laugh that didn't need context to exist. It arrived because it was available, because there was space for it, because something in the combination of that moment and that presence made it possible. They walked to the car. The traffic on Faria Lima was the way it always was, indifferent to everything. The city continued to be the city, enormous and uninterrupted and completely oblivious to what happened inside the people who inhabited it. And Valentina was okay with that. She was okay with the city that didn't stop, with the work that waited on Monday, with the bottle that would finally be opened, with the friend beside her, with the 2 years that had passed leaving in their place, something she recognized as belonging to herself in a way the 2 years prior to that never had been. She got into the car. She put on her seatbelt. When Fernanda started the engine, she was already looking forward. Dear listeners, we have reached the end of Valentina's story. The woman who discovered the truth at the moment she least expected and had the courage to act when it would have been easier to stay silent. If this story touched something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave your comment below telling us which moment marked you the most. Was it the instant she leaned her ear against the wall, the silence of the hall when the audio started playing, or that late afternoon in the vineyards of Bento Gonçalves? Each of your comments tells us that this story reached where it needed to go. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do it now. Every day we bring new stories about difficult choices, true love, loyalty, and new beginnings. Click the subscribe button, turn on the bell so you don't miss any episodes, and leave a like if Valentina made you believe that dignity always finds its way. See you in the next story. End of story. Dear listeners, we have reached the end of Valentina's story, the woman who discovered the truth at the moment she least expected and had the courage to act when it would have been easier to stay silent. If this story touched something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave your comment below telling us which moment marked you the most. Was it the instant she leaned her ear against the wall, the silence of the hall when the audio started playing, or that late afternoon in the vineyards of Bento Gonçalves? Each of your comments tells us that this story reached where it needed to go. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do it now. Every day we bring new stories about difficult choices, true love, loyalty, and new beginnings. Click the subscribe button, turn on the bell so you don't miss any episodes, and leave a like if Valentina made you believe that dignity always finds its way. See you in the next story.